All. Yes, this works. It's my responsibility, but also my pleasure to introduce briefly our distinguished guest, Reverend Dr. Lillian Daniel, who is Senior Minister currently at First Congregational Church, UCC, Glen Ellen, Illinois. She has she did her college work at Bryn Mawr, and she's a religion major, so that means she's one of us. And she has her MDiv at Yale, cum laude too, to be noted, and a DMin with distinction from Hartford Seminary. The congregation she leads, she tells me, has 1,300 or so members, a budget of over $1 million, and a staff of 19. This gives me at least good preliminary reason to think that she can manage a union classroom. It's quite a daunting set of tasks that she takes on there, but in addition to all of this, she's also a notable author and is frequently on demand on the lecture circuit. She has published 3 books: Tell It Like It Is, Reclaiming the Practice of Testimony, This Odd and Wondrous Calling, The Public and Private Lives of Two Ministers, and most recently, just last year, When Spiritual But Not Religious Is Not Enough, Seeing God in Unexpected Places, Even the Church. She also, it seems, has a gift that I would kill to have, namely the gift for coming up with good book titles. So I haven't mastered that one yet. So we're just delighted to have her here and look forward to hearing from you. Let's welcome Lillian Daniel. One quick note, during the question time, since all of this is being recorded, apparently we're not audible if we don't have the microphone, so I'll pass around the microphone at that time.
Thanks. Is that all right? Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I hate listening to introductions of myself. It always makes me sound like a jerk. I don't know why. Does everyone feel that way? But anyway, I want to talk about a couple of things today, and then I want to open it up for conversation because I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Some of the things I want to talk about are the changing religious landscape in this country, what effect that has on preaching, the use of personal narrative, the question of biblical literacy. Those are the things I want to talk about. And if I get them all done, somebody needs to buy me a beer. Okay. The changing religious landscape. We all know it's changing. It's a recent Pew study said that 1 out of 5 people in this country, when asked what their religion is, checks off the box none, N-O-N-E. And that group goes to 1 in 3 for people under 30. That really has probably been the biggest religious news story of the last year. It's been out everywhere. Another more recent study by Barna folks, so that's an evangelical group doing a study, they said, what is the biggest sort of negative association young people have with Christianity? And it was 2 things. One was an inappropriate alliance with politics, in specific, the religious right, and the second was homophobia. So this was an evangelical group studying itself who found these things out. So everything is shifting. The days are over when you went to a specific church because your parents went there, your grandparents went there. The days are over when it's presumed that if you married someone from outside that religious community, that families would shun you or break up over it. I mean, this has changed. There's an amazing fluidity, right, in the American religious landscape. And with that ability to choose, to say, I'm shopping, right? I'm shopping for a synagogue, I'm shopping for a church. Decades ago, when people said that, they said it with a certain irony or self-consciousness, like, I'm embarrassed to say, but I shopped for a church. Today, they say it without irony. They just say, yes, I shopped for a church. So that there is a sense of choice there, right? You could list the good and the bad in that. Denominations, felt the pangs the first, as all of a sudden there wasn't a market share. And so it wasn't presumed that because you were born Presbyterian, you'd go to another Presbyterian church. And so the denominations start feeling this in what's called the main line or the old line, all kinds of different things. But now numbers are decreasing in the evangelical world as well. And there's this enormous fluidity, and it's not just choosing among religions, but it's also having the freedom of choice to say, I am not any of those. And it might have been that there were more people who chose that before, but today there's more of a comfort with saying it. You even have conversations around atheism where people will talk about as atheists coming out of the closet. You know, that it's at a point where it's scary to say that, but they want to be who they are, right? So as a result, you have this weird flux. In the group of the people who check off none, I think that in many cases, institutional churches, in particular, I would say here the main line, have made some assumptions about who the nuns are. And one of our assumptions that comes up a lot is somebody who checks off none is somebody who has an experience with the church but has been wounded by it or turned off and is now angry with the church. And for a while, when Christianity sort of dominated the landscape, that was often true, but increasingly now, that might be one generation of nuns, and that generation of nuns has now had children, and those children have had no experience of institutional religion, and so they have not yet been wounded by the church, to which I'm like, just give us time, we'll get to you, right? But they haven't, and so I think of the nuns as actually possibly being in 4 categories, and I'm playing with this, but one is the category that would be no way, like, I've been hurt, I'm mad, I don't want that, no way. The other would be no longer. And that might be a less intentional drifting away, right? Just didn't compel me anymore. And then the other categories would be the never have, like never been exposed to it. Really, never have. I check none because I never have been exposed to it. And then the not yet. And that's a group that is potentially open and curious. In many cases, I think in sermons, a lot of times, particularly I'm going to address the church, in sermons we are answering questions that are not being asked. And a lot of those questions are theological. So to take my own denomination as an example, the United Church of Christ, when people say, okay, tell me about your church, what's the first thing we're likely to say? Well, that's interesting. No, we would never say that because we never have very many people, so we don't say. But like, no, what we will often say is, I'll tell you what kind of church we're not like. We're not like those people over there who say that, you can't be a minister if you're a woman, and we're not like those people over there who won't do your gay wedding, and we're not like those fundamentalists who say you have to believe these certain things. And at a certain point, if you're having a conversation where Christendom still exists and everyone understands what the church is, whether they're involved in it or not, that conversation makes sense. But if I'm talking to somebody in the never have or the not yet category, that conversation makes no sense. And if they push back and say, okay, Lillian, like, I hear you saying what kind of church you're not, but like, what are you? What do you believe? Well, I'll tell you what we don't believe. We don't believe that you have to believe any specific thing. Okay, but like if you were to say you believed, like I'm really interested, this group is saying, right? And a lot of times in preaching in my own denomination, the preacher is answering questions that are not being asked by people who have never been exposed to Christianity. So to give you a concrete example of how this plays out, at our church, our youth minister, who was raised in a Pentecostal tradition, but then became a part of the United Church of Christ, so she's on a journey. She would be somebody who at one point had been in the no way camp, like really mad at the church, and then became the no longer, and now is back in the United Church of Christ. And so to our confirmation kids in the 8th grade and youth group, she shows this documentary that some of you may have seen called Jesus Camp. Are you familiar with this? Will you volunteer to tell us what it's about? Come on, just tell us. Give it 2 seconds. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So it's kind of like your worst nightmare of what. And so Rachel, who's been a part of a church like that at some point, wants to show the kids this critique, right? And our kids are traumatized because they didn't know that kind of Christianity existed. And we're trying to teach them in confirmation class what it means to follow Jesus, and then they see this movie, right? Now that's a great example of answering a question they weren't asking. At some point, they're going to see that movie, interpret it, want to have a conversation about it, but we have these groups where, like, seeing that movie and having Rachel's critique of it presumes that you know about the wideness that is Christianity, and therefore we land here. Well, in our confirmation class, nobody heard the part about, and we're not like that. And they went home and said, oh, we saw this horrible movie. I'm not sure I want to get confirmed. I don't want to be associated with that, right? So you see what I'm getting at here. And so how does preaching change because of that? My hope is that it's an opportunity for preaching to get better, but preachers have to learn how to be confessional and how to be clear and how to not presume that everyone understands these certain loaded code words of the faith. So we have to be able to speak to a congregation that presumes that there are people there for whom this is all new. At the same time, honoring people who are in the no way, no longer, who've been injured, who've been hurt, who are discovering this for the first time. So what happens? I think the first thing that happens is we reclaim the teaching ministry of the preaching role. That ideally, everybody would come to catechism, we'd have a year together, we'd do Bible study, it doesn't happen. So what happens is we have this preaching moment where if we don't integrate teaching into it and the inculcation of the community and the definition of words and setting things up, but do so in a way that doesn't imply we're being condescending. That we acknowledge that we're looking at a group of people who might know a lot about a lot of important things. They might know a lot about a lot of things that I know nothing about. But we also acknowledge they may be biblically illiterate, either because they've not been exposed to the church or they've been part of churches that did not emphasize that because they didn't need to because the culture did, right? So I think what you find is that preaching that is vital and churches that are growing and bringing new folks in, at some level they've learned that worship and the preaching moment are catechesis and are an opportunity to teach. Along with that comes this one area that I've written about and talked about a lot, testimony and personal narrative. At some point, my concern is that some of our churches lost the ability to testify and to talk about what we believe. So that conversation, what do you believe? Well, I'll tell you what we don't believe. But what do you believe? Have you had an experience of the divine? Well, I wouldn't want to shove it down your throat. No, I'm really curious. Tell me. And so we have people who are in other areas of their lives very articulate, brave even, will come out on social justice issues, will make statements about what should happen in the Middle East and gay marriage, but won't talk about their faith. Here's the irony, lest they offend you, right? So there's this sort of tongue-tied quality. And the challenge is, how do you, if you really don't believe that other people need to attend your church in order to avoid hell, right? Like if you no longer have the burn in hell argument, because I don't hold the burn in hell argument. I do not think that my church is going to rescue you from eternal damnation. Like we're not that powerful, right? And so if I don't have the burn in hell argument, what do I have? I think what happened is we just went to, okay, we're not going to say burn in hell, and we're just going to say whatever floats your boat. Because that's what open-mindedness looks like, right? And we were so afraid of being associated with those other kind of Christians that we are not, who tell you you're going to burn in hell, or don't treat you well and treat you like a second-class citizen. Like we're not that kind of person. But whatever floats your boat is not a compelling story. And I don't believe it's one that our people in the pews really believe, because they don't have to be there. They do not have to be there. I have the privilege of being a minister in an age where, since ordained 21 years ago, I have never looked out at a congregation that had to be there. I'm looking at people who are making an increasingly countercultural decision to worship something other than themselves. I mean, maybe some children are there, maybe a reluctant partner or spouse or two, but for the most part, people really can choose. They're not there to make business connections. There are better places to do that. They're not there because we give 10% of our money away in missions. There are a lot more efficient ways to do that, like the United Way. You know, they're not even there because we have an excellent choir, because guess what? There's other choirs, right? Clearly they're there because of some God thing, and how do we articulate it? And until I think they hear their preachers talking about experiencing the divine, they're not going to want to do it either and talk about it. But if we can get our members to give testimony, talk to each other about it, they might be more likely to give something other than the tired old utilitarian argument when their neighbor asks them about what church is. You know, something other than we have an excellent youth choir, right? But something like, when I went through a divorce, I don't know how it worked, but the prayers of this place upheld me, and there were hymns that we sang that I felt like I was hanging on to that verse for dear life, and a power outside me just seemed to help, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. You know, I mean, that's a description of something that is more than utilitarian. And if we can't talk about that and relate it to what we're doing, we don't deserve to have really anyone join us. So in between whatever floats your boat and burn in hell, confessional preaching, I think we have a shot here for the nuns to change what we do and make us better. One last and final point. I think one of the fears of people who said, you know, we're not like those kind of Christians, one of our fears is that if we claim a label of a particular faith, it implies that we have a disrespect for other faiths, right? What I believe deep in my heart, and it's my own experience, is that when you go deep into a religious faith, you can't help but come up against a generosity of spirit and a call to love that condemns that sort of behavior, that disrespect. So for me, right, as a follower of Jesus, the deeper I go into that, the more I look at Jesus, the more I study those scriptures, the more I see Jesus acting in ways that are not disrespectful to the other, but are loving and welcoming. And so I can't help but notice that the deeper I go. If I had a shallow encounter with Jesus and didn't really read anything about him, I could tell myself that what he's all about is denigrating other tradition, but I can't go deep into that story and not notice that. It's right in my face. So the idea is that why can't we make an argument for the religious life that is not disrespectful of other traditions? It's not the burn in hell, but it's more than whatever floats your boat. It's rigorous, it's reasonable, and it's real. The rigor would be the same kind of rigor that we apply to studying a musical instrument. You know, the idea is that if I study the violin and I put time into it, my ear is trained and I am open to the beauty of the banjo and the accordion and music from all over the world. It doesn't make me hate other music, it makes me love music more. In that sense, if I dig deeply into a tradition, I'm going to love other traditions more and be open. So, those are a lot of thoughts. How do you think that affects preaching? Do you agree with my analysis? Reactions? Anybody recognize the whatever float your boat? Yeah? Okay, good, please. And would you mind, saying sort of who you are? Oh, yeah, because... Sorry, I started thinking. Yeah.
Okay, Stephen Wireman. I found it really interesting hearing you talk about how we talk about the UCC as someone who defected to the UCC in 2005. Because whenever I talk about it, I talk about those aspects that drew me to that church from the church I was brought up in that we believe in doctrinal freedom. We believe in believer's responsibility of engaging the Bible for oneself and working out these theological questions for oneself, of statements of faith, not tests of faith, and all those wonderful things. And I joined the UCC in 2005, just after General Synod, and hearing the news about marriage equality. So I'm wondering if there is a way to be progressive Christians and talk about what we do believe in that sort of positive way. And I do see a lot of value in saying, we aren't like this, we aren't like that, especially in the US today, when Christianity, a very specific, narrow version of Christianity, is so prevalent in the media. When I talk with people in very casual settings, I encounter people who had absolutely no idea that there are churches that allow same-sex couples to marry, or that would even consider someone like me for ordination. So, I think there's a positive way to approach that.
So I love everything you just said, and it gives me hope, right? And that's exactly who I'm trying to talk to, is to say we can be this open, welcoming denomination and still talk about the perspicuity of Scripture and John Calvin and what in the tradition we take from that. And we can study and we can think about our history. We don't just make it up as we go along. Like when we say, we're non-creedal, it doesn't mean I just do what I want. It comes from another tradition, which was, no tests of faith. To have people who can articulate that is really exciting, and I think those are our churches that are doing well, where we talk about those things and we have some expectation. And a lot of the people carrying that message are younger generations who've chosen the UCC in many cases, as I did. I was an adult convert, young adult convert. But also, we want to be able to engage the tradition without constantly having to apologize or say we're not like this, we're not like that, and I think it's also our natural heritage if you think of every part of the Christian family or every religious tradition having some beautiful gift they bring, like one of our gifts is this Reformation tradition of intellectual engagement and debate around scriptures and practice. That's what I pray we become. But until we encourage people to say the things you said, we're in danger of just being whatever floats your boat. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for your talk, and thanks for your presence in chapel earlier this afternoon. My name is Crystal Hall. I'm a doctoral student here in New Testament. And my question in response to your question of how does this relate to preaching is in two parts. The first part is in your sermon today, I felt like the message that you had of this is not about you is spot on for a white upper middle class or even upper class sort of urban self-help gospel sort of congregation. That, I think, for that particular kind of community, I think that message is absolutely right. Especially in the context of mainline Protestant denominations that are largely dying and need to hear that message. Absolutely. But the first part of my question is, how does that text, or how can that text that you preached on speak to communities that have always heard, it's never about you? Those marginal communities that have always heard, it's not about you, it's never going to be about you, we structurally oppress you because it's not about you. So that's the first part of my question, which is very sensitive to the liberation theology context of union. The second part of my question is, as a preacher and in your experience in the pulpit, how do you, if you have that awareness in your preaching of those others and how texts need to be concerned with them, how do you embody that in your own preaching? Does that manifest itself in activism in your congregation? And how does that awareness, if it's there, inform how you would be a preaching professor here at Union?
There's a lot of questions in there, and they're all deep. Want to begin with context. no sermon or message can ever hit everybody. You're in a particular time and place and moment, right? It's one of the reasons I actually don't like recording sermons or having them in written form out there, because they happen in a moment. And I also believe the Holy Spirit moves in some way, and that's sort of impossible to capture in those mediums. So absolutely, and one of the joys of preaching regularly is you don't have to do the whole gospel every time. You get to come back the next week, right? And so that's often the case, that you would come back and another message could use the same text and focus on the giftedness part, for example. And, to people who've been told, you don't count and you can't do it, and to acknowledge that, like, everybody is a member of the body of Christ and we all have this value and love. And, you could preach a very different message around that in a different time and place. I do want to push back and say, I don't think that there are two opposites, and one is it's all about you, and the other is you've been oppressed. Like, I don't think those are two opposites. I think this one is nonsense for anybody, right? And because it's not all about you, right? And if we try to address this huge problem over here, which is justice-oriented, which is about unfairness, which is about evil, it's not about low self-esteem, right? So I don't think the sort of secular gospel of self-esteem ultimately works for anybody, right? Well, there's plenty of stuff in Scripture, though, that comes and presses back toward liberation, toward justice, toward righteous anger, toward God's passion for that. That's where you go for that. But it's not, the answer isn't, you can talk about self-esteem issues this way with this group and this way with that. I actually think the model is broken. Mm-hmm.
Crystal kind of stole my thunder. That's a good question. No, that's good. We'll tag team. Okay, tag team. No. Thank you. And I'm sorry, I'm leaving at 2:45, which has nothing to do, regardless of how you answer my question. So, okay. Exigencies of schedule. Yeah. So, I mean, when I heard Crystal ask you, I'm just yes. Because there's something about this, and I say this as a white person, that sounds very white to me. And by that, I mean that's interested in individuals and is interested in individuals in terms of talking about choice, and is interested in getting the nuns back, or getting them in the first place, right? I mean, this notion of second generation. I have the freedom of being an ethicist, and so I don't necessarily care about that. I don't have a church congregation that I need to, worry about. But when you talk about make an argument for religious life that's about rigor, that's reasonable and that's real, I'm wondering for you as a white pastor right now and who might be teaching in the context of this kind of seminary, how you would preach about a community like that, where the rigor is in part about white people being uncomfortable, and how do you invite people in to discomfort?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, so if you think of, the sort of self-centeredness piece, which would be, I don't want to hear anything I disagree with, right? So right now in our culture, I mean, we're at this weird moment where we can funnel the information that we receive, and we can actually set up a life where we don't have to hear things we disagree with, right? Like in terms of our news sources, we can get our news from columnists we already agree with. We can sort of do this, right? And one thing I think and hope is that religious communities are places where we hear things that are uncomfortable, like give all your money away, or about justice, or this kind of thing. So I actually think this permeates the culture where I hear. So with students I have in the teaching that I've done in Chicago and other places, for example, coming out of the Black church tradition, the version of that self-centeredness and other things can be like the celebrity pastor, or the prosperity gospel, or the name it and claim it. Like, there's a lot of versions of that, and I think it's all the same kind of stuff. We're just putting different words around it, and that's a really big issue. And like, for example, I spoke at Howard University about the book when it came out, and And I've had some people say, oh, that spiritual but not religious thing, that's not a black church issue. But for the undergrads at Howard, they said this is absolutely an issue. All our friends are talking like this. And we're wrestling with this. And so when you've seen one church, you've seen one church. But I do believe that these things going on in the culture and this sort of pushback and the ways in which a lot of our churches have taken on this kind of like needs-based stuff and become almost the thing we're critiquing, I think that goes across cultures. I mean, I think you see that in a lot of different places. I don't think it's just a middle-class, mainline white thing.
Lillian, I'm Marvin Ellison. I'm a union alum and a recent addition to the union staff. And I just want to say thank you for being here and participating in this complicated mating dance of searches. It's it requires a lot of energy, both on the candidate and the community, but it's energy well worth spent. The last time I saw you was in Chicago at the AAR meeting, and you were part of a worker justice march for Marriott workers, and I really appreciated meeting you in the march.
Thank you.
But not every pastor makes those commitments to show up at marches and be a public advocate for justice, and I just want to express appreciation to you and so many other colleagues, especially in the UCC, that often do that. So what do you now know about justice preaching that you bring into your ministry and share in your congregation, both the things to do and the things not to do? And how did you learn that?
Under things not to do, don't get arrested for civil disobedience in your first few months at a new church and not tell any of your church leaders and have your picture be the entire top half of the front page of the newspaper the next day. I mean, I did that, right? I learned something there. I mean, you know, and it was around labor issues, and I'm being hauled off in handcuffs, and my picture's there with the name of the church, and I'd never preached about that or had that conversation, right? I mean, that's something I learned. So I think when you are serving a congregation, there's always that group that will tell you, you can't go out there and do anything that represents us, right? So if you're in the newspaper saying something and it gives the name of our church, that's not fair, you can't do that, you know, you have to come sort of check with us. I reject that, right? Totally reject that. But there's also a balance, which is if they pick up the newspaper or they see you on the news giving a speech and they have never heard anything like that out of your mouth before on a Sunday morning, in some ways you're breaking the contract, you know? So the balance is, I don't want to shame my congregation, embarrass them, or shock them, but I'm not going to come back and take a vote or a poll. Like, I believe in the freedom of the pulpit, and I believe that the pulpit is much bigger than this. It's out in the public square, and there are times where I'm going to do things that upset them and don't represent their point of view. And again, that's part of the pushback. It's not all about you. Like, we're a community. Guess what? Like, you know, there are a lot of people in my congregation who in their work lives do a lot of stuff I don't like either, and I don't want to be associated with. So, but we're the body of Christ. We're broken and we stay together. I think a lot of pastors could do a lot more of that stuff and have a lot more ability to do it than they know. But they get hamstrung and sort of, they listen to the wrong group of people, and it's a very small group. And often they could have been much more courageous and really done something. So I just kind of put that out. So I mean, I've made mistakes in it. I've come close to, I've skated on some thin ice. At one point I was being sued by Yale New Haven Hospital, and 2 lawyers from my own congregation, you know, were the ones doing it. You know, and you can survive these things. You can, I mean, and in some ways the way we survived it has as much to do with their generosity as, you know, anything else.
Hi, my name is Tony. I'm a MDiv student here. And I didn't come to seminary with any career intentions, but still had to take preaching and worship and exegesis, which ended up being very informative for what might happen after I graduate. So when I was taking those courses, I was learning to preach with this idea of wanting to know how this would matter, like you mentioned, for other work. Just learning how to speak well or deliver a message that's meaningful and life-giving. And so that is in relationship to some of the things that came up as you were speaking about the nuns in this changing landscape. And one of the ways that I'm mindful of the changing landscape is just in what it looks like, that it's an increasingly browning country, more mixing, more changes in all sorts of ways. And in some ways, what's reflected in places of worship can also determine people's comfort with being in those places. And so I'm wondering two things. I'm wondering about how you envision participating in the union community as a preaching professor who's in some ways modeling something else for people who aren't interested in doing ministry, but will need to be taking lessons from you about doing some sort of leading. And also how you imagine, I think maybe I would like to hear more about how you imagine all of these changes of the country mattering for what you think we might be needing from the church. Like what are we called to speak into a country that's a little uncomfortable with rapid change, and how do we live into leading that proactively without perpetuating things from the past? That makes sense.
Okay. I want to definitely touch on the idea of who's in the preaching class, right, and what their hopes are and what they do with it, but also to sort of say that part of what I would hope in moving into a role of teaching is that I'm helping in some ways to equip all of you who are going to be those leaders and are going to be navigating this, right? And so what that looks like is not clear, but it's exciting to be a part of that. So who's in the class? So in my teaching, increasingly I think seminaries have to look at this. We require preaching, and then half the people in the class are never going to do that in a sort of pulpit setting, and yet we teach it as though that is the case, right? And what are we doing there, and does it really transfer? You might be much better served to take a public speaking course, somewhere else, right? And just like, so what is it, what are we doing here? And how might we imagine teaching preaching in different ways? So one question I got from the faculty is, what's an imaginary class you would like to teach? And mine was preaching outside the pulpit and exploring this idea of what preaching looks like in these other settings. So you're on the picket line, at the protesting the Hyatt at the AAR, and you stand up and you're relating the struggle of the workers, in Chicago to a biblical text. And what do you say and how do you say it? And how's that different from what you might say in a homily that leads up to the Eucharist in an Episcopal church around the corner? What does it look like if you are working in a hospital setting as a chaplain and you're giving a message to 5 people in the hospital chapel and you don't know anything about them or what they're dealing with, and they don't say a word, they just sit there weeping? What does that look like, right? And also, what about all these different forms of religious community that are web-based or that take place in writing or take place in other ways? Like, how could we talk about that together? And would there, in the end, be anything we could even cling to that says, this is what preaching is, and it makes it different from like a public speaking course or social media course? For me, that would be the sort of bare bones is you have this responsibility to connect to this text. And you can do that in all kinds of places. I mean, politicians will do that, right? Politicians often preach. They relate, a social justice issue or their own situation to a biblical text. They are preaching. How can we talk about that kind of space and imagine that? And also learn more about the various contexts that are unfolding. That's what I think would be interesting. Mm-hmm.
All right, yeah. A lot of interesting things to think about here. And I wanted to raise something, and I want to be clear from the outset that it may sound like I'm trying to point out a contradiction in what you're saying, and what I'm really trying just to do is to get you to talk about the interaction between two different things I've heard you talk about. On the one hand, there was that message in your sermon of and here too, of it's not all about me, and trying to get against this what did I get out of the service kind of thing, or what am I getting out of being part of this community sort of focus? I'm a consumer. Did you give me the product I wanted or not? Which I think makes sense. On the other hand, I hear this strong emphasis in your talk today and elsewhere on testimony, personal testimony. And the example you gave, which I thought was powerful, was somebody who's gone through a divorce and found something beyond themselves that helped carry them through the process, that felt real to them, and they wanted to go further with that. I mean, that's very compelling to me. At the same time, I thought, as you said that, well, that sounds like it's about her. So, I mean, how do you put those two different kinds of things together? I mean, are there legitimate places where, yeah, it is about me in some deeper way, and then other places where that question is not so appropriate?
Right. So I deliberately tried to choose an example that wasn't extraordinary, right? Like I could have said, here's my testimony. I experienced the love of God and I gave away everything I owned. And like that's an extraordinary story. I don't hear that a lot, right? I don't hear that a lot. I'd love to. I can't give that as my testimony, at this point. I think there's a way of sort of acknowledging that we're both, and that God meets us there in our own self-interest, in our needs, but also we have these moments of openness and compassion. And to be honest, so often those powerful moments happen at some point of hopelessness or sadness or misfortune. I mean, that is true. That just seems to happen that way. When my life's going great, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about other sources of power. I tend to sort of think I've got it down, right? Like, hey, this is working, I don't need that, It's when I'm broken that I have these experiences sometimes. It doesn't mean in any way to say, oh, isn't it great to be broken, or, suffering's redemptive. I mean, you're not saying that, but it's just there's something about when life is difficult, sometimes the pretense and the mask and other things get pushed out of the way, and you have that need to rely on the mercy and love of God in a different way.
My name's Emily. I'm a second-year student at Union, so I'll be here for another year, and I'm excited to find out who will be teaching us. And I know what brought me to Union, and I know kind of the picture that I have of what Union was when I was coming here, and I could tell you what some of my friends thought about Union when they were coming here. But what's kind of the picture of Union that has brought you here?
That's great. The picture of Union that brought me here. I mean, in some ways, yeah, I have this image of Union from 20 years ago when I was applying to divinity school, or 23 years ago. And at that point, to me, what it represented was, liberation theology and feminist theology and challenging the status quo and challenging the church and Christianity and, all of these things like that. And I understood that in sort of like an intellectual way, right? What I didn't know, because I wasn't a part of this community, was how that works itself out. What does that look like in real life, right? And I think that in this sort of 24-hour period, this weird meet and greet, prove yourself / psychological torture, sleep deprivation, I mean, it's a very weird thing, right? But it's sort of like this heavy exposure where it's a sort of stressful way to connect with people. What is interesting to me is that all those intellectual things seem to be true, but I'm impressed that there's a spirit of community and generosity, and that it feels like I felt a lot of openness to conversation and sort of a willingness to press me or engage me. What do you mean by that? What do you mean? Because sometimes in settings, those same forces can cut off conversation because everybody's so afraid of getting it wrong, right? And I have no interest in being a part of a community where you can't get it wrong, or you can't take risks, or you can't debate and have conversation. And that's going to happen. I mean, and I think the church at its best does that. And so in order to do that, you have to be willing to fail, to not always be covered in glory, to enter into conversations that you don't know a lot about, to get it wrong, And if I can't get it wrong, I'm not going to grow. If we can't get it wrong, we're not going to learn. If we all shut down and polite, lowest common denominator, let's not say anything that anybody couldn't agree with, to me, that's boring and not compelling. So part of what I'm trying to figure out is this a community where you can do that, where you can take risks, where you can argue, where you can disagree?
You've spoken several times about the importance of the preacher testifying about his or her own experience of the divine. Would you give some examples about some possibilities there and ways in which that might be done in a liberating mode, bringing in inclusive mode, and ways in which it might be might be another case of narcissism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the bad news is we never know, right? You know? I mean, that was what I began the sermon with. How do you know when you think too highly of yourself? How do you know when you're getting it wrong? Conversely, how do you know when you're not thinking highly enough of yourself? You know, when you're buying the culture's, degrading nonsense, right? How do you know? I mean, in my sermon today, I tried to share an experience of the divine, right? I mean, a mystical moment for me. But another one would be like, well, this would speak to the person at the back there who I'm waving at with my UCC friend. I mean, this is a good example of two ways to talk about something, one in which you talk about the divine experience and one in which you don't. Like I could say, I'm really proud that I was a delegate at the United Church of Christ General Synod in the year that they voted on marriage equality. Like, I got to be there. It was a moment in history. And I was so proud, and we were the first denomination to do it. And at that point, we were ahead of the state and, talking about this early as we do. And I couldn't feel better about that. And, that's why you should join the UCC, right? Here's another way to tell the same story. Because guess what? That vote could have gone another way. I could have been born Episcopalian. I could be part of the Presbyterian Church now, where I might have all the same convictions around this, but my denomination is splitting up, breaking up, and in agony and pain over this, and I'm embarrassed by what's in the news, And I'm no better or worse a person just because by accident of fate or birth I happen to be there, when we had that vote, right? So how would you talk about that in like a faith way? Well, I would tell this story. I was a delegate there, right? And I'm sitting there and I'm wondering how the vote is going to go. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be positive. I mean, we kind of have that sense, right? And then the conference minister of the Puerto Rico conference stands up and says, are you aware that if you vote yes on this, you are going to lose the entire Puerto Rico conference in one vote, right? And I'm looking around at this predominantly white organization and seeing this small amount of diversity could just go in one vote, right? And then he goes on to say, but I'm still with you. I love you. You're going to have to do what you think the Spirit is telling you to do. And so it's not clear, right? And I was like, what's he saying? What's he saying? Other people talk, but then our general minister and president stands up, and he says, I want to just say one thing. He says, we're about to take the vote, and he says, when we take the vote, I don't want anybody to clap, no matter how it goes. Like, if it goes your way, I don't want anybody to clap. And we all kind of knew it was going to pass, but it was very sobering for him to say that. And he said, and what's going to happen is that then I'm going to stand up and say a prayer. And so the vote happens, and nobody claps, and we all just sit there with this almost unbearable complexity of the knowledge that you never get it right. That we're losing this conference. And yet, I felt the power of the Holy Spirit so profoundly, and it was so humbling. And then to have a pastor who said a prayer instead of doing a victory dance. And when I came back and told my congregation about that, and I had people who were mad about it, and people thought it was great, I really felt like I'd been a part of something godly that was different from any other experience. And it happened in the body of Christ. It's that combination of you are beautiful and amazing and created in my image, and it's not all about you. You don't get to get it right.
This will have to be the last one.
Cool. Thanks. So we've heard a lot today about your experience in the church and your experience of what you might like to teach at Union. And I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit more about your work in the academy, and to hear a little bit more about either the preachers or the theorists that inform your work, and how you think about yourself as teacher and academic, in addition to thinking about yourself as pastor and preacher.
Okay.
Jamal Calloway, I'm an STM student here. And attached to that, can you also talk about how you would teach preaching in an interreligious, multi-religious community?
Yeah, so the second question is steep learning curve always, right? Because just when you feel like you get some familiarity with something, another thing is introduced. So a sense of being open to learning about context and all the complexity that brings. Academically, a lot of the kind of thought I've done around teaching and preaching has been Connect America right now, related to the public square. So it's that's kind of a lot of stuff that I really enjoy. Even people I disagree with, like Ross Douthat, who is trying to talk about, heresy, right? And sort of the way in which he sees Christianity as having sort of sold out to the culture in all kinds of ways. And while I disagree with much of it, in some cases, it's very provocative stuff, and he's sort of a foil for a Diana Butler Bass. So those are some of the areas that I'm interested in.
Well, let's take a moment to, again, express our gratitude. I've never thought of this as a mating dance, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.